Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Moon Podcast. Now, I am excited about this one because this is a story of human history. It's about all of us. When we look at the world around us, we find that not every person is the same. Everyone is different, be it culturally, genetically, or environmentally. Every country, every continent, every region within tells a different story of how we came to be. Not every person had the exact same starting point as everybody else. The same applies today as it did throughout human history. These things are determined by external factors, in this case, the environment. We all evolved differently. We may have evolved from monkeys, as I talked about in my previous video about evolution. However, when we look at the history of mankind, different climates, different geographies, when all this comes together, we have a completely different picture. When we zoom out, what we find is that different people have different histories, that is, geographical histories, that still affect us today. Hence the different backgrounds we all have. It's about empathy and understanding. So, in this episode of the Moon Podcast, I'm going to summarize thousands of years of human history. Let's go! Ever since we evolved from monkeys, we began to find ways to survive based on our environment. We became hunter-gatherer societies. While the men went out hunting for large creatures for food, the women and children gathered food, such as berries and vegetables. At least, that way we had a balanced diet. However, when we zoom out a little bit, we begin to see a pattern. Why is it that we don't see much civilization in places such as the Arctic or the Sahara Desert? The answer is simple. One place is too hot, the other is too cold. But that's not all. From a hunter-gatherer's perspective, where are they supposed to gain access to water, if not from rivers that are close by? How can they develop tools if there are no trees nearby? People stayed in places like these because it made life easier. As we can see, people are shaped by the world around them. That's why people moved around and migrated to places that are more suitable for their needs. However, things did not stay the same forever. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors eventually became sedentary farmers. Why is that? As we humans evolved from the Homo erectus to the Homo sapiens, we all migrated from Africa before spreading across the rest of the planet. Once we found a suitable location with an environment that suited our needs, we simply stayed there to live and breed in. Why? Because it suited our needs. For one thing, if hunters killed all the animals in one location, that meant they had to travel even further away to hunt for food. When they discovered a place where they can grow food such as barley and wheat, it made more sense to stay in that one place and grow it. They also figured out that instead of hunting animals, it made things easier by simply breeding them in captivity. Why kill animals for food when you can breed them in the same place? It saves time and energy. By the time one group of people found a good spot to grow food, the rest of them kept hunting and gathering elsewhere as they migrated. This is why some places were settled much later than others. For example, there was no human settlement in Iceland earlier than around 800 AD or 600 AD, and it wasn't until around 1250 AD that people reached New Zealand and settled there. That's a long way to migrate from Africa. Hunter-gatherer societies were constantly on the move. This prevented them from growing their population fast enough. For example, a woman could only carry one child at a time until it was able to walk at the age of 4. But farming societies meant they can have as many children as they liked without having to worry about moving because all their sources of food and water were in one place. One prime example of such early civilization is in the Middle East. The Fertile Crescent is the perfect example of why such earlier civilization thrived, while the rest of them didn't. The Fertile Crescent was one of the few places on Earth that had the perfect balance of a suitable climate to grow crops, where the barley and wheat grew naturally, as well as a good source of water and trees, all in one place. Once again, people are shaped by the world around them. When we look at the climate of the Fertile Crescent, such as the Near East, we can see that the climate was suitable for growing crops. The weather was not too hot or too cold. It was just right. With its range of hills and rainfall, this enabled people to grow crops on valleys and hills to gather food at different times of the year. Wheat and barley were first cultivated in the Middle East. Today, these regions are known as Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, around 10,000 years ago. That would have been around 8000 BC. Now, what about breeding animals for food? Surely there must have been plenty of animals around the world that could have been domesticated in order to be bred for food. Actually, that's not the case. When we look at the animals that were domesticated, they all had certain characteristics that enabled them to be grown and bred in captivity, such as the goat, the sheep, the cow, the pig, and the horse. They all provide a good source of protein from their meat. They are not dangerous, they can be tamed, they can breed in captivity, and they don't take as many years to grow in order to reach adulthood in order to be eaten. They are a lot easier to farm in captivity, unlike, let's say, elephants, zebras, and cheetahs. Elephants take many years to grow and do not breed as often as cows do. To prove this point, after mating, an elephant needs 22 months in order to give birth to a baby elephant, whilst cows need about 9 months, almost the same length as a woman's pregnancy. Zebras do not like to breed in captivity. They are more aggressive than horses. They are known for biting people, and they cannot be trained like a horse. And cheetahs? They cannot be bred in captivity. In order for cheetahs to mate, the male needs to chase the female among other courtship rituals in order to breed. Well, that's not going to happen in a cramped farmyard. In short, just because animals were present in some places, it doesn't mean they can all easily be captured, farmed, and eaten. Not every environment had a suitable wildlife for human consumption. The environment of the specific geographic area simply did not allow it. So, once again, as we can see, people are shaped by the world around them, and that includes the animals that were available to them for farming in order to eat. But this new innovation of farming came at a cost. With animals and humans living in close proximity to one another, diseases began to spread. Animals would carry germs and viruses and pass them on to humans, such as smallpox. This killed many people and animals. Eventually, humans and animals alike began to develop stronger immune systems that killed the viruses. Whenever a new disease came along, they would infect the animals and humans. Some would die out, while the rest of them would survive, only to develop a stronger immune system. Now, you may be wondering, what did the farmers do with all that free time since they were no longer hunting? This enabled them to specialize. With a rapidly growing population and an abundance of food, this enabled people to develop innovation for technologies and other things. One group of people made tools for farming and weaponry, bringing forth the dawn of metallurgy. Another group of people began to make clothes. Another group of people built houses. There was a distribution of labor among civilizations. And then a new invention would arrive that would change the world forever. Writing. Writing was first invented by the Sumerians around 3400 BC, who lived in the region we mentioned earlier, the Fertile Crescent. However, it wasn't invented to write poetry or tell stories. Not yet, anyway. The main reason writing was invented was to keep a record of stocks and crops. It was the first sign of accounting. It was basically invented to keep a record of who owned what and how much one owed to whom. A very basic language formed and developed over time. It would be until the year 2100 BC that the Epic of Gilgamesh would be written. However, writing was not available to everyone. It was only used among the wealthiest. Those who had the most amount of crops and farm animals were the wealthiest. Civilization began as an egalitarian society because in hunter-gatherer societies, everyone had exactly the same thing. They built their own houses, shared the same animal they hunted, and shared the same food they gathered. There was no room for innovation or specialization in a hunter-gatherer society. But in sedentary farming societies with access to food and tools, small families grew into tribes. Tribes grew into chiefdoms, from chiefdoms to kingdoms, etc. In doing so, they created a hierarchy system based on class. When we look at the history of every civilization, we find that every single one of them began as a tribe that grew into a bigger civilization. Early governments began to form, and these governments became centralized with a leading authority. Religion was invented to justify the reasons why one group had to own more than others, mainly for spiritual reasons. A priesthood was invented to maintain the system at a spiritual basis. A tax system was invented to allow the leader to make decisions that was best for the chiefdom. As long as the chief of the chiefdom did the bidding of the people, the chiefdom remained at peace. So, getting back to writing, only the wealthiest, such as the priesthood and the chief, had access to writing because they were the small number of people who played an important role to make sure everyone paid their taxes to the king in order for the king to use the resources accordingly. Meanwhile, hunter-gatherer societies had no government system, no tools, no means to grow crops, nor did they have access to writing. At this point in history, hunter-gatherer societies were still using stone tools as well as primitive spears made of sticks and stones. Meanwhile, early kingdoms had access to swords and armor. They had sophisticated government systems. They had all the animals and crops they needed for food. It's also worth mentioning that the island of Cyprus was colonized around 12,000 years ago. According to a study conducted by Professor Konstantinos Deltas from the University of Cyprus, while researching for hereditary diseases in the Near East region, he discovered that the native Cypriots lived on the island for thousands of years, long before the Greeks and the Turks set foot on the island. Cyprus had a culture of its own, with its own writing system known as the Etio-Cypriot script. If you are to go to a museum, you will find evidence of an ancient Cypriot language that is yet to be deciphered, such as the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the Museum of Idalium in Cyprus, and the Sanctuary of Aphrodite in the Palea Paphos, also in Cyprus. The evidence is there for all to see for themselves. Cyprus is an island with fertile land ideal for farming. It required a government and a writing system to keep things organized, along with a mythology of its own. This was the foundation of a Cypriot culture before it became colonized again and again as time went by. Once again, people are shaped by the world around them. As time went by, this knowledge of technology and farming began to spread throughout the rest of the world, across Europe and Asia. Eventually, we had empires that dominated the Eurasian continent. It is worth mentioning at this point a date that changed history forever. On the 29th of May, 1453 AD, the Ottomans captured the city of Constantinople. When the Ottoman Empire imposed taxes and regulation on the goods passing through their territory, this made overland trade very expensive for Europeans. With high tariffs, blockades, and trade disruptions, the Silk Road, the trade route that connected the East and West on land, came to an end. This made Europeans want to seek elsewhere to trade. Thus began the era of exploration. So they took to the sea, looking for new land to conquer and more resources to gain. However, little did they know that they would discover a new continent. Which brings me to the next important date in human history. In 1492 AD, Christopher Columbus and his army of men arrived at the Caribbean islands, which were densely populated by Native Americans. This was the biggest clash of civilizations in all of human history. primitive tribes encounter one of the most advanced civilizations at the time, the Spanish and the Native Americans. But before I continue about this encounter, we need to understand how the Native Americans came to America in the first place. I mentioned earlier that we all migrated from Africa before spreading across the rest of the planet. Having migrated from Africa, other hunter-gatherer societies migrated eastwards from Africa, heading northeast towards Siberia. As they traveled further northeast, they reached the coast and spotted another land across the sea. That land would later be known as Alaska. So, they crossed the Bering Strait over to Alaska, and then they migrated all the way down into South America. As the years passed, America would be densely populated with Native Americans. Throughout these migrations across the American continents, they did not have farming as sophisticated as the Fertile Crescent thousands of years earlier. This meant that they did not develop the immune system from domesticated animals. This meant no innovation or development of technology, and no centralized government, and no writing of any sort. In short, the Native Americans were frozen in time due to a lack of a combination of a suitable climate to grow crops like barley or wheat. Instead, they relied on corn and beans as well as fruit and vegetables. They didn't have suitable animals to domesticate like cows, sheep and goats that the Europeans would later bring, although they did have alpacas and llamas for their meat and wool. While the Eurasian continent was using animal labor for farming, the Native Americans were still farming by hand using handmade tools. Once again, people were shaped by the world around them. And this is where I come back to that big encounter between the Europeans and the Native Americans. At this point, the Spanish had guns, steel weapons, and armor. The Native Americans were no match against them. But the Spanish brought with them an even deadlier weapon: germs. Because the Native Americans never lived among animals for centuries in order to develop immune system from the diseases that animals carried with them, thousands upon thousands of Native Americans died from the very diseases the Spanish brought with them. And that is how Europeans colonized the American continents. It was all a matter of luck. Groups of people being in the right place at the right time with access to the right resources. Again, people are shaped by the world around them. This is what shaped our history. Now, you may be wondering, but what about the Chinese? Didn't they have ships as well as Europeans? Why didn't they discover America first? In order to answer these questions, we need to take a look at the opposite side of the Eurasian continent. When we look at the European peninsula, what we see is a long coastline of peninsulas within peninsulas, with islands full of forests, rivers and mountains, such as Greece, Italy, Spain and Scandinavia, to name a few. All these places have different climates around Europe which created different cultures that clashed and collaborated with each other. On the other hand, when we look at China, although it is mountainous with lots of rivers, it has a much more smoother coastline. Actually, China was a monoculture throughout most of its history. As time went by, when Chinese kingdoms unified and became centralized under one empire, it was ruled by one emperor who would become one despotic leader that would inhibit China. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang. In 1371 AD, he introduced what was called the Haijin policy, which banned shipbuilding to reduce naval threats, banned maritime trade and voyages. This was to prevent China from being influenced by foreign countries. In other words, the bad decision-making of one emperor cost an entire empire's ability to trade and discover new land. This in turn stifled innovation. Meanwhile, Europe did not have this problem for two reasons. 1. Europe was never ruled under one emperor. It never had a centralized government that spanned the entire continent. 2. When one culture invented something, they shared it with others. Other parts of the continent traded with one another. So, if a government wanted to ban something, all one had to do was to move elsewhere, which permitted its use and trade. Once again, people were shaped by the world around them, shaped by their environment. So, after the Europeans encountered the Native Americans, all the kingdoms around the world expanded into empires, stretching into continents, each of them expanding their influence, fighting for resources and power. The First World War and the Second World War brought all these empires to an end. Now we live in nations. The rest is history. While we are on the subject of empires, I will briefly mention two of the biggest empires the world has ever seen: the Mongolian Empire and the British Empire. One ruled the land, the other ruled the seas. Once again, we are seeing the parallel of the elephant and the whale, which I mentioned in my previous video about evolution. They complement each other, like the yin and the yang, which I also covered in another video. There is an interesting parallel here. These became huge because they made the best of their environments. What enabled the Mongolians to expand so much was that they made use of their environment effectively, particularly the Eurasian steppe. In the 13th century, the Eurasian steppe was the perfect breeding ground for expansion. With plenty of rain and mild winters, this provided all the vegetation needed to feed their horses. The Mongols were a nomadic people. They didn't stay in one place for too long. Rather, their strategy was to move from one place to another where they can get the resources they needed, especially in preparation for battles. When we look at the map of the Eurasian steppe, this explains why the Mongolians were able to conquer such vast amounts of land. As we can see, the Mongolian Empire completely covers the whole Eurasian steppe. Once again, people are shaped by the world around them. But they had limits they couldn't overcome. Since the Mongolians were a nomadic force, and every other civilization was sedentary, with their own castles, fortresses, and farms to sustain them, this was the yin to their yang. Despite the vegetation and the food the Mongolians had access to, it wasn't enough to sustain an army large enough to conquer the whole Eurasian continent. With the Chinese in the east, the Indians in the south, and Europe in the west, it was not possible for a mobile army to take on every sedentary kingdom all at once. Once again, people are shaped by the world around them. Now, in contrast to conquering land, we have the British Empire, who ruled the seas with its navy. With a vast fleet of ships, this enabled them to travel around the world, exploring coasts of lands far away. The British Empire reached its peak in the 19th century. This gave them access to all the resources they needed in order to feed the empire for expansion. However, the British were not able to conquer all land because they didn't have an army big enough to invade every foreign land all at once. The reason for that is because the British were sedentary agricultural societies, while the Mongolians were a nomadic society. This is why the Mongolians didn't have a navy. The British were an island people, surrounded by water, which forced them to look elsewhere for resources, which enabled them to have an empire which spanned across the seas. The Mongols, by contrast, were in the middle of a vast continent, with a variety of climates that forced them to migrate from one place to another. Once again, people are shaped by the world around them. Once again, the parallel of the elephant and the whale is right there. However, like all civilizations, they all rise and fall. As I said earlier, the rest is history. And that is human history in a nutshell. To conclude this video, I would like to recommend a book that is worth reading for more information. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. I have read that book several times. It's a fascinating read. It's one of my favorite books. This will only give you a summary of human history. It's an ideal starting point for taking one's journey for reading history. Another book I would like to recommend is called The Greatest Invention by Silvia Ferrara. She goes into some historical detail about some of the ancient writing systems around the world, which is also a fascinating read. As you can see, every person is different because we all came from different circumstances, different backgrounds. This is ideal for our mental health because this way we develop an understanding for other people. The more we understand other people's backgrounds, the better we understand each other. Because no one is ever exactly the same. No one has the exact same circumstances or environment that shaped them into what they are today. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been enlightening to you. Take good care of yourselves.